you very much. Well, welcome everybody to what I'm calling part one of the owner's manual for the hypermobile spine. Part one because it is there's no way that we can cover all in this short hour. But let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. So my goal today is to try and explain a little bit about the science, the underlying mechanism, if you will, of hypermobile spines. They are definitely a unique challenge, and those of you who have them understand that. And then I want to talk about the importance of sequencing for exercises, and then actually go over some exercises. So if you have a ball and a TheraBand and perhaps even a foam roller, you can go ahead and grab them while I'm doing the upfront stuff, and we'll go through some exercises towards the end. But I also understand that this is going to be a pretty speedy version of reviewing exercises. So I have a handout that we can send to you afterwards, and it will contain video links to the exercises so that you can kind of review them on your own. And then maybe, depending on your interest, there'll be a part two where we can really dive into the exercises and then and talk a little bit more about next steps, because certainly I'm trying to deliver the basics today and not get too exhaustive. So what is a hypermobile spine? We ought to start with definitions first. It could be this. That's clearly, a pretty dramatic hypermobile spine, and probably a systemic hypermobility where there's really some significant laxity. But it doesn't always look like that. In fact, a lot of times when we see it in the clinic, the differences between the photo on your left and the photo on your right. And hopefully what you can see is the photo on your right, that this person has excessive range of motion, and that can be for a variety of reasons, and we're going to talk about those reasons. But it's not always this dramatic presentation of hypermobility everywhere. Sometimes, it's more common than we think, but it's also they're not always obvious signs. I think from a clinical standpoint, the thing that we hear, the history that we hear that's such a hallmark of a hypermobile spine is somebody who does not like to sit still. So they get very uncomfortable if they're sitting for a long time. They get very uncomfortable if they're standing for a long time. These are folks who really like exercise because they need that input into their system so that they know where they are in space. The challenge is that these are also folks who, when they exercise, because they've got the type of spine they have, they can be easily injured if they introduce too much force too fast into that spine. So let's dive in and a little bit more and kind of give you this visual of what we're talking about when we talk about a spine. I kind of separate spines into three different models. I'm simple and I like simple models, and so there's sort of the ladder, there's the slinky, and then there's the bed spring. The ladder is very stiff and those are folks that have a really hard time moving through space, and actually, frankly, there's a whole lot of physical therapy literature that is focused on the too stiff. The just right is a spine that has stiffness like a bed spring, but it can move out of position and then right back into position without a lot of deformity. And then the slinky spine, as you can imagine, is kind of a loose goose spine where there's not enough stiffness in the springs or between each spring to actually support the big power play muscles that we often use for running, jumping, and playing. So I'm going to stop sharing this slide deck for a minute because I want to show you what I mean. All right, I don't need to show you the ladder because I think we all can imagine what the ladder is, but here's the spring, kind of the bed spring model. And in an optimal spine, you have enough stiffness between each of these rings, right? And that stiffness is created by ligaments, it's created by little tiny muscles that go spring to spring, and then it provides great leverage for these long power play muscles. But you can see that when I deform the spring, which means I bend forward or I bend backwards or I twist, it restores back to neutral. And that would be kind of the ideal model. Alternatively, we have the slinky. Yes, and first of all, you can already see there's not really sufficient stiffness to really know with certainty that if you move out of position that you're gonna stack right back up the way you would optimally like to be. So that's the slinky model. And the challenge is not only, you know, in terms of having appropriate stiffness, but those with hypermobile spines often feel like they're stiff, right? Because their muscles, their big power play muscles are contracting really hard, and they're often short and tight because they deform the spine underneath. And so somebody with a hypermobile spine often wants to stretch. And here's the challenge, and you can see this. If I stretch, so here's my hamstring, one end of my hamstring here and the other end of my hamstring here, and I stretch, what hopefully you can see is that the loose goose areas get exploited, right? So you end up stretching what's already stretched and you can't localize to what is stiff. All right, so that's the challenge of the hypermobile spine. All right, I'm gonna put my springs aside and go back to sharing my screen so we can talk about this a little bit more. All right, hold on. My screen doesn't like to share when where is it? There we go. All right, so there are lots of different ways to sort of identify hypermobility. And what you see on your left side is one system for really identifying whether there is systemic laxity through all of your joints. And that's, you know, if you have that, then perhaps that needs a little bit more than just a physical therapy intervention. But frankly, even with that kind of systemic hypermobility, you still have to deal with how do you exercise the system and how do you try and create some appropriate stiffness so that you can run, jump, and play without pain. So more often than not, we're talking about, or well, I should say for today's lecture, we really are talking about this model on the right-hand side, which is what kind of seatbelt, what kind of restraints are missing, and what kind of restraints can we put in place when we are talking about managing a hypermobile spine. So to understand the restraints that we're going to try and build, we have to understand kind of how the spine is put together and what's the difference between a normal or stiff spine and a hypermobile spine. So let's talk about the passive restraints. The passive restraints, the structure of our spine that prevents our head from falling off of our trunk or our trunk from falling off of our hips has to do, I mean, there's some real structural framework, right? And so it's vertebral bodies and the discs in between them. And those are present and typically not the issue whether you've got a normal spine, a stiff spine, or a hypermobile spine. The bones are generally pretty good. Then you have these joints called the facet joints that happen between each vertebrae out on there are extensions from the spine called processes. Some go straight back, some go out to the side, and the facet joints are what connect the vertebrae from their side extensions, one to the next, okay? And those joints have capsules around them, and those capsules in a hypermobile spine can be somewhat loose. And then if you'll notice all of these ligaments that travel from the bottom of your spine all the way up in the front, and from the bottom of your spine all the way up in the back, and some in between sections as well. Those spinal ligaments also can have different qualities depending on how you came out of the factory. Sometimes those qualities make it really stiff, a really tight rubber band, and sometimes you were on the assembly line when they were using a little bit looser substrate, and so there's a little bit more laxity in the system. So at a passive level, and certainly if you have a systemic issue, often it is all the way at that ligamentous issue. or excuse me, that ligamentous level. So regardless of whether you are sort of systemically hypermobile or just more locally hypermobile, we have to figure out how to create some more stiffness. So how do we take a slinky whose ligaments maybe are not doing their job and not restraining, and how do we think about creating more stiffness one ring to the next? And that's going to be our goal. Okay, so sorry, that's exactly kind of what I was talking about. So when you have a snug seat belt, or you have more of the bed spring, those passive systems, those passive structures, I should say, tend to be a little bit stiffer. When you have kind of a loose goose seat belt, not quite tight enough, then those structures tend to be a little bit more elongated. There is nothing we can do to change that underlying base for people. So our options are, but it does influence how we choose to exercise and the sequence of exercising that we do. So the next step are what's called the local controllers, and really what I call these muscles are the muscles that snug the seat belt. These are the deep postural muscles that are responsible for, when we exercise them correctly, they are going to start to close the gap between each slinky ring and start to create what I'll call some appropriate stiffness. Okay, so let's look at those muscles. They are we're looking at the lumbar multifidus. Okay, so the multifidus are these strappy muscles that go from a spinous process, the extension that sticks straight out from the vertebral body, and they connect 1, 2, or 3 levels below, but they're very short muscles, to the transverse processes, or the extensions that go out to the side. All right, the multifidus is a huge steering wheel of our pelvis and our spine, and it's really important for not only creating stiffness, appropriate stiffness, but also controlling where this slinky is in space in terms of spirals. It's a very important muscle to have good control over. It needs to be activated. You need to have control, and you need to have endurance. You also have these tiny little muscles that typically go from one slinky ring to the next, and some of them go from the side extensions to one side extension to the one right below it, and some of them go more in a rotary direction, so they're going from a side extension or transverse process down to the spinous process. Okay, but those are all the little muscles. When we say we're working on your deep postural muscles, those are the muscles that we're talking about, and they have huge impact on creating as much stiffness as we can in a slinky. Okay, so if we're hoping to create some appropriate stiffness, we've got to get to the deep postural muscles. And how you exercise those muscles is very different from what we think about in terms of running, jumping, and playing. The other muscle that we're talking that is important in terms of local control or snugging the seat belt, which you may be more familiar with, and you certainly can get your hands on, is this transverse abdominis. Okay, this is important because its fibers attach to fascia in the front and fascia in the back. And so when those muscles contract, it acts like a corset, and it gives your spine, your slinky, a big hug. And so that's why you hear us always talking about trying to activate that transverse abdominis, not so that it just creates this strong sort of a drum, but that it actually is drawing tissues in closer to support the column of your spine. And then we have the power players, right? These are the power play muscles. These are the run, jump, and play muscles. And frankly, these are the ones that many people are focused on, right? So you've got your internal and your external obliques. You've got that run here and here. You've got your rectus abdominis, or your six-pack muscle. some of the large back muscles that you see when you're looking at weightlifters. And then some of you are very familiar with this side muscle, the quadratus lumborum, which is part of its side, placed side and back. But it's a big, thick muscle that also is a big part of run, jump, and play muscles, and can get, you know, very tight and sore. So run, jump, and play muscles, power play muscles, the key for understanding why we want to put them aside in a hypermobile spine initially is because those muscles attach, let's just say from the top to the bottom of the bed spring, right? They have very long attachment sites, and they skip a lot of rings in the spring. So they might attach up here, and they might attach all the way down here. But when they contract, they're going to distort the spring. That's what creates movement, right? If I want to run and jump, then I need those big power muscles to move me through space. But I also need them to move me predictably through space. And you can see with the slinky model, or the bed spring model here, that when the muscle contracts, it's a pretty predictable motion. I come down and I come up. I come down and I come up, okay? That, a power play muscle works very well in a stiff spine and in a bed spring spine. It's a little trickier though in a slinky spine, and here's why. And hopefully you've already guessed it, right? If I attach at the top here and I attach at the bottom here and I start to bend, the motion is much less predictable, right? So because there's not enough stiffness in between the slinky rings for me to guarantee that each time I contract that power play muscle, I'll do it the same direction we did before, that each time I contract that power play muscle, that it does the same thing. So this time that the middle slinkies are pretty straight, all right? But the next time I contract, they're very bent. So the forces of a muscle that attaches from, has a long attachment from the top all the way to the bottom, it produces much more force, and it bends the spine much more dramatically. And that's why it's very hard for somebody who's hypermobile, if they get deconditioned and their slinky gets even bigger, then it becomes even more challenging to contract those power play muscles without getting injured, okay? All right, so the big question is what to do, right? The most important concept is, first of all, are you hypermobile? And we want to talk about ways to think about, to identify whether you are hypermobile or have a hypermobile spine. Let's focus on that, a hypermobile spine. And then if you do, what can you do to help create appropriate stiffness, which means you have to focus your exercise first on those local controllers, on the snug the seatbelt muscles, the deep postural muscles. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we do want to have a way to test for it. And so certainly as simply, you can go back to the picture where we have the seated testing, where you're not really worried about what's happening with your legs and your arms. And, you know, if you can spin your shoulders around so that they're at essentially 90 degrees to your hips, chances are that you're pretty hypermobile. So in this first picture, her shoulders are at about 45 degrees to her hips. In this second picture, her shoulders are pretty much at 90 degrees to her hips. That would be a key indicator that there's there's excessive range of motion in your spine. And again, the other thing to remember is that often folks with hypermobile spines do not like to be in the same position for a really long period of time. They like to move around a lot. All right, the other thing that we can do is something called the SFMA. So this actually stands for the Selective Functional Movement Assessment. And, oops, I have a big typo there, apologies. But the way that this, it's a series of movements, and I'm actually going to show you a video on what these movements look like. And it's a series of series of movements that typically are scored in the following way. You can move through the full range of motion, but it's painful. You can move through the full range of motion, but it's not painful, and that would be considered normal. You can't move through the full range of motion and it's painful. That's a PT issue. And you can't move through the full range of motion, so you're stiff, but you're not particularly painful, and that may or may not be a PT issue. In the hypermobile spine, though, it's not only that you can move through the full range of motion, you have excessive range of motion, and it frankly may or may not be painful. So I'm gonna, this video actually is funny because it is actually meant to be an example of sort of the optimal, a person who scores optimally through this series of testing, but she actually is hypermobile or has excessive mobility, and you'll see that. Now she may or may not be in pain, and you will also see she's very well conditioned, and so that is her protective mechanism. That's how she manages her excessive range of motion. All right, so I'm going to click over here. Okay, we're not going to run through all of it, but you know, right away, it's a series of movements, starting with cervical extension or looking up towards the sky. And you will see that as she does this, you are concerned for her spine. Yep, that's a slinky right there. I know it happened very quickly. You don't see it as, there, you saw it again. And you don't see it as much as she tucks her chin forward, but I actually am going to come back. I'm going to come, as she comes into her cervical flexion, you're going to notice that her spine does not, her spine doesn't just tuck straight down. There's actually a big detour in order for her to get her chin to her chest. And that's, again, what happens with a slinky. You see that her chin, she tucks down and then her chin actually starts to slide further down her chest. Is that very fast? But that's what happens when you have a slinky, because the forces just impart more distortion into the system. And we'll just kind of, again, this is just to give you an idea, but you'll see how much range of motion she has for her turning her neck to the side and tucking down, turning her neck to the side and tucking down. And then I'm going to skip through these because they are not essential for our conversation today. I'm going to come right to the spine motion. Okay. So clearly she has lots of length in her hamstring. If she had dropped her head, her nose would actually probably have dropped all the way to her shin. And this looks like a lot of dancers. But there's a lot of range of motion here. She doesn't even do the typical compensation that we see in kind of a normal bed spring spine because she has so much range of motion. And then we're going to look at extension, and you'll see how far back she goes with her extension. Yep, hopefully you all can appreciate. Now, what you should also appreciate is she's fairly tight in her hips. And you can see how muscular her legs are. And that's in part because the tail is trying to support the dog, right? So she's got really tight hips and a really tight connection from her tail into the dog. Right? It's a really tight connection from the bed spring into the slinky, because this bed spring is going to try and control the slinky from the bottom up. It's not a very efficient way to do it, but it's kind of the only option unless there is some good training into the system. All right, and then let's just take a look at her rotation, because again, I think you'll be able to appreciate how much range there is when she rotates. Whoop. It's almost a Linda Blair. Whoop. There we go. All right, so that is not necessarily designed to make you an expert in determining whether you have a hypermobile spine or not, but it should help you understand how we assess for hypermobility. All right, coming back into my slideshow. All right, so how does this influence approach to exercise? In the typical a functional movement pyramid, and there is a functional movement pyramid. If you're thinking about the slinky, or excuse me, the bed spring, or even the ladder model of a spine, you have to make sure that things are mobile, that what's stiff, that anything that's too stiff, you want to make sure that that is loose before you start to stabilize, because otherwise you're going to just make things tighter and tighter, and it's not going to be very comfortable. And then once you've focused on and achieved a good foundation of moving what's stiff and stabilizing what is weak, then you can add in strength, power, endurance, and then finally athletic skill. So these are the building blocks of good functional movement. When you have a hypermobile spine, the mobility and stability pieces have to flip, because we have to try and first create, sorry, I lost my slinky. That's pretty scary since it was right in front of me. We have to try and create appropriate stiffness, slinky ring to slinky ring, before we add in some stretching, which is going to have to be really careful, because otherwise we're going to, and very controlled, because otherwise you're going to exploit what's already mobile, and you're not going to actually get to what's stiff. And then once we've got that, then you can add in your strength, your power, your endurance more safely. Now, let me just comment about endurance. Certainly when we're working on these local controllers, we are going to be working in 3 ways. We need to activate them, which means we need to make you aware of them. They've got to come online. And we have to, and then we have to teach them how to work. And then we have to challenge their endurance, because we need those deep postural muscles to stay online throughout the day. We just need them to help contain and control where the slinky is throughout the day. All right, so this is where, if you have your balls, your TheraBands, and your foam rollers, you could pull them out. But I am going to go through a series of exercises that are really meant to be the baseline. So the key first step stability exercises to activate, train, and then challenge the local controllers and create appropriate stiffness. All right, so the first one is ball bouncing. And for those of you who are on the call who have been with me, you definitely are aware of ball bouncing, because I've given it to you. The reason I am giving it to you is because ball bouncing is very confusing to the power play muscles. When I bounce, it does 2 things. It activates the muscles that go from slinky ring to slinky ring. It wakes them up. It says, hey, what's going on? I can't be asleep. Why are you bouncing into me? But it also, at the same time, these long strap muscles are like, what the heck is going on? That is not a run, jump, and play action. I have no idea what you're asking of me. And what it actually does is it helps to shut those big power play muscles off. Those are the ones that feel stiff because they're overactive, right? So the ball bouncing is powerful because it stimulates the local controllers, the muscles that go slinky ring to slinky ring, and it deactivates or causes the big power play muscles to start to shut off. And so that's the first stage for starting to create a snugger seat belt at the appropriate level. And you can see the variations here where you just bounce, you can add some arm movement in. But the point, for variety really, but again, the point is really that compression and relaxation, that quick compression and relaxation. And what you should notice is, as I'm bouncing here, I am not trying to control the bounce with my legs. I actually want the ball to bounce me back up, because I don't want to diminish the repetitive nature of this bounce. It is the repetitive nature of this bounce that is what's activating those muscles that come in between the slinky ring. All right, so that's one. Then we have, again, if you've been with me, you've heard me talk about railroad tracking. So railroad tracking, I'm going to play this video and see if you can start to see what's happening with my legs there. So I'm seated, and sorry, I've added a bounce in there. I'm going to pause right there. So I'm seated on the ball, and what you saw me doing was telescoping, let's just call it my right leg, telescoping my right leg forward and retracting my left hip. And I call it railroad tracking because your thighs, your legs stay in parallel. Your knees don't wander out to the side. They stay in parallel. That railroad tracking is beginning to train the local controllers, especially the multifidus, to steer. And it's trying to teach steering through the pelvis and up the spine, as well as trying to help the hip learn to control the spine, okay, or learn to contribute to, actually that's not even true. It's not contributing to control of the spine. It's actually teaching the hip how to not get in the way of the multifidus or take over for the multifidus. So what you see me doing here is the railroad tracking to get started, and then you'll see me hold the railroad track in one direction, so the telescope with my right and the retraction with my left, and spiral into that retracted leg and bounce there. And the reason we do that is that actually refines the activation. So now we're getting some subtlety in, because I don't want to just activate this way. I actually have to activate, in rotation, in both to the right and to the left. And it also helps me relax those power play muscles one side at a time. So let's just look at that again. Whoops, nope, I'm going to back up. Nope. I'm going to back up and click play. There we go, so that you can see the railroad tracking. So there's the railroad tracking, right? Legs stay in parallel, and then you'll see me really anchor into that hip retraction on the left in this case, and you see me adding the bounce in, okay? And what that is doing is creating some challenge for the multifidus and demanding some endurance, but it's also starting to relax all of the power play muscles that are involved in one side at a time. This is the simplest way to explain it right now. All right, and then there are definitely some advanced variations. So how do you add resistance to railroad tracking, for example? And so in this case, you'll see me wrapping the TheraBand around and in a way so that I get resistance to the railroad tracking. And I want you to pay particularly close attention to how much difficulty I have maintaining control over my hips. So this is I'm demanding more of my multifidus, I'm demanding more of my local controllers, and I am trying to change what my hips are doing so that they aren't so responsible for trying to control the slinky from the bottom up. And you'll see that my hips are not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. So there's the wrap, just to get the resistance, and I'll turn on diagonal so you can see. And then you'll see the juddering that's happening in my thighs, right? That juddering is happening because the hips, the power play muscles at the hips are not wanting to let go. And that frequently happens when we're starting to try and transition from power play muscles to local controllers. There's this juddering that goes on because the power play muscles are going, what the heck are you asking me to do? This is not in my bailiwick. What are you doing? This is not, I'm supposed to be doing powerful movements, and you're asking me to do these little tiny movements. And that's exactly what we're looking for, because when we keep on it, that's what causes the power play muscles to shut off and not take over. Sorry, we'll just look at this one more time. You can tell I recorded these videos very early this morning. I was not quite awake. There you go. All right, moving on. Nope, moving on. All right. Then there's some other variations, right? So once you've gotten the big hip muscles to get out of the way, then we can start to add some other variations in. And this is just, again, to help you understand I don't expect you to master this exercise right now, but it's to help you understand the progressions where now we're going to railroad track, and you'll see my right leg is railroad tracked forward, telescope forward. My left hip is retracted. I'm now using abdominals to pull my spiral around. So this is my anterior muscle chain. I'm using those. So I'm getting the power play muscles to help me now. So this is the anterior power play muscles helping me really crank the spiral, and the arm in the back, those are the posterior power play muscles that are trying to help stabilize, create more of a rotation from the back. So now this is a combo move, right? I'm going to start, you're going to see, I'm going to start the bouncing. I've got the retraction or the railroad tracking in place to control my multifidus and take my hips out of the equation. But now I'm also using the power play muscles in a way to help lock, that's not a good example, to help lock the spiral in so that I can then create some endurance challenge for those deep postural muscles. So this is what it looks like. Then you'll see me set it up on the other side where you can see me reverse the telescope. That's my left leg telescoping forward, my right hip retracting. And this actually, for most people, this is the harder side. It's usually much harder one side to the other. This side is usually the easier side. And the other side is usually the harder side, and that has to do with just kind of how our organs are laid out and where our diaphragm is in the ribcage cavity. All right, let's move on. So we've gotten all of the little muscles in between the slinky ring, right? And we've gotten the multifidus. We've started to work on the multifidus, and then we've kind of shut down the big hip muscles. Now we need to work on the tush, on the transverse abdominis. And so we do this with what's called the tush push, right? So this is ball bouncing in a way, but now you're doing it on your hands and your knees. And what you'll experience as you put that ball between a wall and your tush and you push back, what you will experience is the only way that you can push back is that transverse abdominis has to contract and corset in, because otherwise your spine would collapse. Okay, so immediately that transversus gets it, it contracts, it starts to snug in, and then when you're pushing back, you're working on endurance. And this is just several variations on a theme for this exercise. So here we're pushing straight back. And then when we add some arm variations in, we're adding them in while we maintain the pushback. That transverse abdominis is engaged here, and it's hanging on to create that corset. And now we're working on endurance of the transverse abdominis. And challenged by introducing different forces in. As you move your arm into different directions, you're introducing different forces, angles into the transversus that it has to stabilize against. All right, we've talked a lot about the multifidus, and so the multifidus, when we've started seated on the ball and we've done the railroad tracking, and then we wrapped a TheraBand around it and we did a little bit more railroad tracking, and that got a little bit harder. Kind of the culmination of this sequence to really train the control of the multifidus, and even more importantly, train endurance, challenge the endurance of the multifidus, because again, we need that turned on all day long. So we have to find ways to make sure that we focus our exercises into that muscle, which we need to be strong in terms of endurance. Okay, it doesn't have to be a power muscle, but it has to have a lot of endurance. And so here what I've done, just the setup is I'm on a half roller. You can be on a full roller. I've certainly in my classes had people do it off of a full foam roller, or you can do it off the edge of a stair or a series of yoga blocks. But the point is that you're kneeling on the height so that you have room to railroad track. In this case, this is my left knee is the free knee. And I'm going to railroad track that left knee down to the floor. So that's telescoping to the floor and then retracting straight up towards the ceiling. And again, the railroad track is because my legs, my femurs stay absolutely parallel. They don't wander out to the side. And that's what creates the rotation in between each ring of the slinky to strengthen the rotatory muscles as well as the multifidus. So the ones that are even deeper to the multifidus. All right, good. That is that one. And then I want to talk about one muscle that we that I didn't mention before. It's because it's not one of the deep rotary muscles, but it is a strong stabilizer from the front of the spine. Okay, so this is the back of your spine and this is the front of your spine. The psoas, the iliopsoas, is actually a really strong stabilizer in the front because it lays right along the front of your spine before it threads into your pelvis and comes down to your leg. So the psoas is real. There are not a lot of muscles in the front that can stabilize the slinky from the front. The psoas is the biggest one. And so how do we use that? How do we recruit the psoas in a positive way? To help stabilize the front, and that we do that from what I call a high hip flexor position. It means that we have to train it from 90 degrees when our hips are flexed from 90 degrees and higher. Anything lower than 90 degrees and that hip flexor, that psoas will not preferentially stabilize the spine. It'll actually preferentially turn into a power play muscle to flex your hip. All right, so we're going to look at two different variations on this. This is back to the ball. This is a kind of a tricky wrap. Pause here for a minute. So we're going to combine a lot of things in this seated exercise on the TheraBand. First of all, you see that the TheraBand is tacked under both feet, but I have a short tail in this case on my right side and a long tail on my left. And that long tail allows me to wrap that TheraBand around the front of my ankle, back of my calf, and front of my shin. And then what you'll see happen is I am going to telescope that right leg forward. I am going to retract that left hip back, and which turns my pelvis over my, no, I'm on the wrong side. Sorry, that's my left leg that's telescoping forward. I'm retracting my right hip, and that's going to turn my pelvis over my right side, and I'm going to take that spiral and lock it in. And then I'm going to train the hip flexor. So that's what's going on in this video. See the telescope on the left, the retract on the right, and now I'm going to float that left knee up and down. And you see that is hard. It's a hard challenge because I am trying to demand that the psoas stabilize my spine. That does not mean that your hip flexor isn't going to get tired here. It will, and you may feel it in the front of your hip when you're doing this, but it's in part because that's a range of motion that we often don't train in. And so our hip flexor is just in general, and our psoas, we're really demanding something very different from the psoas portion of our hip flexor. So this, the exercise on your left, on the left side of your screen, that is training that psoas on the left in what I would call an open position. My pelvis is twisted away from the working leg or the psoas the target psoas. The half kneel hip flexion, actually, we are going to spiral towards the hip flexor that we're strengthening. And so what you'll see me do is kind of exaggerate the open and then the close. So I'm telescoping or railroad tracking towards the target hip hip flexor for strength training, because we need to make sure that that psoas can stabilize in an open spiral as well as a closed spiral. So the seated one is the open spiral, the half kneel is a closed spiral. That's what you'll see me emphasizing. So I'm opening the spiral and then I'm closing it up and really trying to turn my pelvis towards my working leg. And then you see again, lifting that thigh up from 90 degrees and above. And that's going to train the psoas as a stabilizer on the front. All right, I think that does it for us. Not bad. You saved some time for questions. Thank you. Ooh, I see a question coming through on the Q&A. Will part 2 address the upper spine? Yes, we can certainly. There are some things to do for the upper spine, for hypermobility in the upper spine. So yes, we can add some exercises in there. My thought also is that we might want to try a part 2 where we actually all go through the exercises together instead of just watching them on video. So we'll reach back out to you all and see what makes the most sense. So we have a question here. If you have disc issues, can you do all of these exercises? Oops, I lost the question. Where'd it go? Okay, if you have disc issues, can you do all of these exercises prior to surgery and degenerative issues? I think it depends. You certainly would still, so one of the challenges when you have pain is that pain shuts off those local controllers. Pain itself, actually, there's wonderful research out there that shows that low back pain actually shuts off your multifidi and all of your deep postural muscles. And so that actually exposes you to further damage and further injury. So you can do some of these exercises, but you have to let pain be your guide. So you would start with perhaps bouncing, but it would have to be very gentle. So you might not be as aggressive in your bouncing as I was. You might not be as aggressive in the railroad tracking as I was in these videos. But they're certainly appropriate to try and regain that local control, because that local control will actually diminish the forces going through your spine. So it should decrease your pain. All right, I have a great deal of pain and need a fusion at L4, L5. Again, I would try these exercises. I would start with the bouncing just very gently and see how that goes. And then you can kind of add in a little bit at a time. And it may be for something very specific like that you try them and then reach out to us. I think when you've got acute pain, it can be a bit harder to know which exercises to do and which exercises not to do. So for acute pain, you don't even have to come in, but we can have a virtual session where we can really kind of talk through your specific issues and understand which exercises will make the most sense for you given what your symptoms are and which exercises we might put on hold. All right, let's see. How does an SI joint relate to a hypermobile spine? So the SI joint can either be a participant in the hypermobile spine, or it can be stiff in compensation for trying to compensate for the hypermobile spine. So if it's stiff, it really often is because the muscles at the bottom, at the base, your hip, your glutes, your hip external rotators are often really tight because they're contracting so hard to control what's above them. And that contraction actually creates a significant amount of compression into the SI joint. So you can have a lot of SI joint pain, not because there's anything wrong there, but because that's that's the tail trying to control the dog. And then very interesting, do we offer personal training on this at Body Dynamics? Absolutely. And any one of our trainers can work with you either virtually or in person, and certainly can focus on the muscles that are appropriate. Great question. On a daily cycle, why do postural muscles turn off overnight or whatever? So part of it is in the hypermobile spine. Those deep postural muscles don't have as much endurance as we want them to have regardless, right? And so there's this constant kind of need to refresh them. The other thing is, if you are sitting in a position, or you're in a position for a really long time, and there's this creep, right? There's this creep that happens, which causes the power play muscles to spasm or guard, and that guarding can shut off the deep postural muscles, the local controllers. Pelvic instability related to spinal instability. So I'm really, I think, I don't like to use the word instability, because instability is actually a surgical intervention, right? So hypermobility may be because things are a little bit loose, right? The ligaments may be looser. You got the looser version than the tighter version. But a lot of times hypermobility is about whether or not those deep postural muscles are able to stay turned on. Instability is really, it's further down the spectrum. And so instability often does require surgical intervention. So my guess is we're talking more about hypermobility than we are instability, but I'm happy to have a consult directly with you to help understand the difference between where you are on that spectrum.
Jen, we had a couple questions come in through the chat.
Okay.
If you have disc issues, can you do all these exercises?
Yeah, I think I answered that.
And yeah, then how about, are these?
So for the disc, just to reiterate, for the disc issues, just to, again, pain is going to shut off the local controllers, and even in a normal spine, you need those local controllers, those deep postural muscles, to be active. It's just so much harder to keep them turned on when you've got a slinky underneath it. So you can do these exercises. You have to approach them gently, because when there is an acute situation, then we may have to do things to really, we just may have to approach it a bit differently. So you can try with the gentle bouncing and kind of build from there. But if you find that it's aggravating, you should stop. And again, probably better for that specific to contact us for a PT consult. And then there was another one. Are these exercises good for a ladder back too? Yes, they are. You just will not, you won't have as much range of motion. You may not notice that you're moving quite as much, but it certainly is going to help create more endurance for the for those deep postural muscles, and it may help the power play muscles to relax as well, which, to the extent that they're contributing to some of your stiffness, it's appropriate. There's another message down here in the chat. Whoop. Is there a recommended number of repetitions or sets daily? Yeah, I typically, it depends on how many of these that you're doing. So if you were to do all of these, it should take you about 20 minutes. Otherwise, we kind of, the ball bouncing, I typically, you're trying to build endurance. So you can start with 5 minutes and you can bounce for 15. And that, ultimately end up bouncing for 15 while you're watching television or what have you. The more subtle exercises I typically do in sets of 8 or 10, and 2 to 3 sets of 8 or 10. How does hypermobility contribute or create issues like labral tears? Yes, I am. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm actually very familiar with that. So I have a hypermobile spine, and I also had a labral tear, and it ultimately transitioned into a total hip replacement. over the years. But again, what happens is because, so, you know, we talk about these local controllers creating appropriate stiffness in the spine. They also are what lift your spine and your pelvis out of your hips, right? So you're trying, so it actually creates more space and room in your hips when those deep postural muscles are engaged. And the other piece is that when your hips are trying to compensate for a hypermobile spine, so not only is there a lot of compression in there, there's a lot of muscle force that's creating more stress inside that hip. And it can really crank down on the labrum, which is what over time then tears. The good news is even with those labral tears, I will also say that I managed it for a labral tear for more than 20 years by making sure that the local controllers, my deep postural muscles were well exercised, were engaged, and so I was able to compensate appropriately for the labral tear.
One more question there through the chat. How does the hypermobility interact with the sacrum slightly out of place?
So again, often the sacrum is out of place with a hypermobile spine because the hip muscles, particularly the glutes, are trying to control the spine above, right? So if you and those glutes are so your sacrum doesn't go out of alignment by itself, right? It goes out of alignment, quote unquote, in context. And the context is one group of muscles starts contracting and another group of muscles is not restraining enough. Okay, so it's intimately related because we need to get the whole system to be working properly so that the power play muscle, namely the glute on one side or the other, is not yanking your sacrum out of alignment. And what often works with the glute on one side is your hip flexor on the other side. Where it's not strong as a stabilizer, it's overactive from sort of 0 to 90 degrees. It's overactive and it has no concept of how to stabilize above 90 degrees. So the glutes and the hip flexors are acting as power play muscles in a hypermobile scenario, and it typically creates that SI joint pain. And that sense of being out of alignment. We call it out of alignment all the time, and I'm guilty of that as well. It's really sloppy language, though, to be perfectly honest, because it's not that the joint shifts out of alignment. It's that the muscles are contracting in a way that cause abnormal force, more forces to go in one side and not enough forces to go in the other side. So that's the asymmetry. So it doesn't mean, and why that's important is that often people say, well, you need to just crack me back into place. I need to be manipulated back into place. And that's a very short-term answer, because the manipulation, the moment of manipulation will cause that big power play muscle to relax and you'll feel relief. But then when you walk out the door or you go sit in your car, you're 5 minutes later or 10 minutes later, it all comes back. It's because there was nothing to retrain these muscles to do what they're supposed to do. So it's really important, you know, we try and train, the body dynamics PTs try and train ourselves to not say out of place, because it's not accurate. And it also leads people to think that we can just crack you back into place and that will be sufficient. That might be the initial intervention, but it is not sufficient to hold your system and have your system operate the way it's supposed to. Hypermobility and scoliosis, goodness. That's probably a longer conversation than we have time for here, but I definitely would love to follow up with you kind of offline, if that makes sense. Beautiful. Thank you all so much for coming and attending. I hope to catch up with you soon. We've got your, we have your email addresses, I believe, Gwen. So we can go ahead and follow up with a handout. I just have to put the video links into the handout. And then we can get that out to you early next week.